That Beatles song, man. What do you think about the Beatles song?
Right. Um, I was quite excited about it, to be honest, because I was never a Beatles fan back in the day. It took me a long time to become a Beatles fan because
Yeah.
I kind of objected to what I saw as the lightweight nature of McCartney's input and the harking back to, I think he was harking back to the likes of Cole Porter and people like that were writing these multi-dimensional songs that there wasn't just verse chorus and all that kind of stuff, and it always sounded kind of sugary and lightweight to me. But as I got older, and at that time I would have said, oh, Lennon's the guy that I really like, because he's the real sort of cutting edge of it all. And he did do Revolution Number 9, which, I mean, that's the most extraordinary track that that's ever been on a Beatles album, and he did that, but you could argue that it ruins the White Album, but okay. So, but as time went on, I listened to Lennon's solo output, and aside from the song Imagine, which I love, he didn't really manage to reach any of the heights that he reached with the Beatles, as far as I'm concerned personally. It was all very strange. And I think what was happening was when Lennon left the Beatles, when the Beatles were no longer around, Lennon was surrounded by people who would not argue with him. And Lennon could be a kind of prickly character at times, and he was such a powerful figure in music that, what he said went, and quite often it wasn't right, so you listen to his solo recordings and they do suffer from that. They suffer from, this is a guy, he doesn't have George Martin anymore. And the minute you take George Martin away from the Beatles, you're really taking 50% of what the Beatles were away. And McCartney got round that, and I realised that I did actually like McCartney. I like Band on the Run, and McCartney did some experimental stuff under the name Fireman, which was great. He did that with Youth, and so I ended up with more of a kind of an appreciation of McCartney, and that brought me back to the Beatles. And I started tracks like When I'm 64, which McCartney wrote when he was 14, which in my previous incarnation I would have said, well, that's a shit song. When I'm 64, that's not a rock song. That's Cole Porter or fucking, I don't know, somebody from that era, from pre-rock era. But it was McCartney writing before rock and roll. So when rock and roll came on, McCartney kind of changed, and McCartney kind of embraced the rock ideals and tried to I think Helter Skelter was one of his, or there was something anyway that he tried to make really heavy. So he was experimenting in ways that I thought Lennon was. When I used to listen to the Beatles, I thought, oh, that's Lennon's bit. Quite often I realise now it's not. That was McCartney. Lennon's bits are different than I thought. So that's my background with the Beatles. So I've come to love the Beatles from Revolver on. From Revolver on, I like almost every album, although I don't like all of the tracks on the albums. But especially the remixed Revolver, I think is absolutely fantastic, as are all the remixes. So that brings us to what I call the posthumous Beatles tracks, which is the tracks where Lennon's not there. And the first two, I can't remember the names of them, but I'll put them in the tags for this when it goes out in video. Those first two tracks I thought were very poor. I thought they were the whole idea was poor. I thought, no, you can't really do that. You're having to process Lennon's voice to the point where it doesn't really work as a good vocal. It's not a good vocal, and you've constructed this kind of Lego brick house round about it, and it's a kind of it didn't really work. So come to the new one, and I'm hearing what they're doing, that they've managed to extract his voice from the piano backing, and I know how they do that because I can do that now with the RX10 and things like that. We can all do that now, and you see that a lot on YouTube. People will be extracting voices to analyse them, or they'll be playing the track without the voice, because we can now do that through AI. And so I was quite excited. I thought, well, that could be really good. So I went and listened to the Lennon original, and it's got a really, really interesting sort of harmonic bit to it in the verse, which is really kind of unusual and brilliant. And then the chorus kind of falls flat. The chorus is a bit kind of just pedantic and ordinary, and yeah, okay, right. And I thought, well, it'll be interesting to see what McCartney does with that, because that's the bit, I'm sure, if they'd been in the studio as the Beatles with George Martin there, you know, McCartney or Harrison or even Ringo, I don't think Ringo made suggestions like that, but somebody would have said, oh, try a minor chord there, or instead of that C, play a D flat, we'll modulate it a bit, something like that, you know. There's something that could have been done with that little bit, but because Lennon's not there, that synergistic process that makes a Beatles song something amazing didn't happen. So what you're left with, in my view, is you're left with half of a great song and half of a musically, half of a not so great song. And when you put it all together, then what do you do? What do McCartney and Harrison and Starr do with that? Well, you bring in Jeff Lynne, who's a Beatles wannabe, and you bring him in, and he understands the Beatles, so he understands what's going on. Harrison brought him in back in the 90s when they did those other two songs. And you get to this song, which is the third one that Yoko's given you permission to use, and you're kind of like, Harrison walked away from it. And I think I always admire Harrison for that. He walked away from the Beatles at one point, and he walked away from this. He said, no, it's not working. You know, it doesn't work. That was okay. So he's got some parts on it before he walked away. And Starr's obviously there today doing his drums. And then you've got McCartney doing everything else. And McCartney even had this is the bit of McCartney that I don't like. He wanted the credits for all the Lennon-McCartney stuff to be changed to McCartney-Lennon. That's not right. That's bad. I don't like that. I don't like that side of McCartney. And on this track, Now and Then, he did a slide guitar part as a homage to Harrison, and that's not right. That's not right. I don't think it's right to take Lennon's voice and do this with it for any of the three tracks. I don't think that's right. I think you're not achieving what you could achieve as the Beatles by doing that, and to compound it by trying to emulate Harrison without Harrison having any say in that is, again, you're not. This is not the Beatles. This is Paul McCartney with his old chum Ringo Starr on drums. It's really a Paul McCartney exercise. So the music's half good and half mediocre, and the production is just over the top. It's just too much of everything. They've got a fucking orchestra in there, and they couldn't tell the orchestra it was for a Beatles song. They pretended it was for a McCartney song. So did the orchestra? What was the orchestra thinking at that point? And who was marshalling the orchestra in order to make it work? Yeah, so. I was excited. I did listen to it. I've listened to it several times. I've tried to penetrate it. I've tried to figure out where all the parts are, and I can't. It's overproduced in my view. There's too much on it, because they had to mask the fact that when they extracted Lennon's vocals, it didn't come out clean. It didn't come out absolutely clear. They've had to process it in order to make it worthwhile. So that's what I think. It's a mistake, I think, from my point of view as a latter-day Beatles fan. I wish they hadn't done it. I wish they would just let it go, and I wish they would. If McCartney and Starr want to work together, do that. You know, they're both great guys, and they just do that. Just do a McCartney Starr thing, and that will be the Beatles fans will love that just the way they love this. You know.
Yeah, I've tried to all the facts and stuff about the recording of it, I've gleaned since I first mentioned it to you, and like the day it came out. But I tried to approach it like somebody at work just said, "Hey, have you heard the new Beatles song?" Like on the WebEx chat. And I was like, "What new Beatles song?" well, I wasn't prepared to hear a new Beatles song today, but let's put it on. I put it on immediately, decided right here, listened to it on my studio monitors. And my initial reaction was it's simultaneously overproduced, yet still managed to fall flat. Like like sonically, it's like pre-67 for the Beatles. Like as far as sound quality, like everything off of Sgt. Pepper's sounds more lush and afterwards, which is, to me, I found astounding that far removed, they couldn't make it sound more beautiful than anything, right? But I was hearing the limitations in the vocals. Like anybody that produces music hears immediately there's something seriously wrong with Lennon's vocals. Like it's like they've tried a lot to hide it, and I have a feeling that I haven't heard the original, so that would probably give me some more information. But I have a feeling that if they'd worked more with that nostalgic broken vibe, they could have actually got something a little more touching that harnessed that broken feeling. Like the way David Bowie, when you listen to Black Star, there's parts where you could tell he could barely get his voice out. And instead of waiting for a good day to get a better take, they left it as it was because that broken part of it is what made it more powerful. You could tell it was a man on his deathbed struggling to get his last words out rather than someone trying to make a perfect record, because it does sound perfect, yet it sounds flawed in a beautiful way, which makes that album more perfect, I guess, if it can be more perfect. But for me, like I think I said to you in that email I sent, that I feel like if that song was released on Rubber Soul or Revolver maybe, it probably would have been a standout track. But from looking back at what the Beatles were capable of and what they were doing, what they're capable of long after that fact, because this was recorded, 78, was it, or 76? Something like that. Lennon recorded this.
Yeah, it was
originally.
Yes, it was in that sort of 5-year period where he effectively retired from music. Exactly. Yeah, somewhere in there. I don't know the precise date, but somewhere about there. Yeah.
So like I feel like there was this. It was like a step backwards in so many ways, and then that's not counting the moral parts of it. Like I'm not even considering any of the moral repercussions or ideas that you're using the recording of someone who's dead, mixing it with someone else who's dead who added to it 20 years later. It's a very convoluted history in that song that should, like you said, it's almost like it should be left alone or just redone. Like take that vocal part and then record the vocals as McCartney, and write the song as a tribute. Like this is a song that got started by Lennon, finished by us, and not to bring Pink Floyd back into this, but it reminded me of the same weakness that Endless River album suffered. I don't know if you ever listened to Endless River.
I have, yeah.
But like for me, that was monumental for me because the last new Pink Floyd record was Division Bell, right? I was 10 years old when that album came out, so I don't remember it coming out. It wasn't impactful for me, right? So when Endless River came out, it was my first chance to give it a proper welcome to my collection the way I normally do, right? Which is if it's Saturday night, psychedelic drugs, a couple of good friends, and a dark room, and loud, right? And I remember when I listened to the Endless River. The first time I listened to it on acid with some friends, I was moved to tears twice. I cried twice during the album because I remember thinking, I thought the album was going to be terrible, but it moved me in a beautiful way. But I listened to it again the next day, sober, without the childish wonder in my mind, and it disappointed me through and through. Like the whole album disappointed me, and you could tell the parts where they're like, "Oh, we found a recording of Richard Wright playing some piano here. Let's use that." And you could tell like it wasn't intentional. It was even more of a throwaway than that Beatles song, I think the Beatles did a better job than Pink Floyd did with Endless River. But it reminded me of that same thing, and it made me feel gross, and it just felt so just like, because that's probably going to be the farewell. That's going to be the last Beatles song like we ever hear, and that's a fucking tragedy. That's going to be like the last offering the Beatles gave to us was this song, and it's tough. But there's still things about the song I like. Like I love. It's got like a bit of like a Middle Eastern feel to it. I love the little bit of thing that he's doing with his voice there. Like I can see why they heard that and went like, oh, this could have been great, but they didn't do a very great job at making it that way.
Yeah, I think there is a problem that's associated with old musicians, and it brings it back to the Roger Waters discussion that we had. Old musicians don't hear treble. These guys cannot be hearing a full mix because they don't hear it. So who's doing that mix for them? Who is making the decisions about the upper frequencies that they can't hear? Because they're probably limited to 5K in their 80s or approaching 80. They can't hear it.
No, Giles Martin was involved with it, right? George's son.
He was.
But he's probably
yes.
old now too, right?
No, he's
probably
not.
old
No,
too
he's
now.
no, he's okay. He's still
Yeah?
got all he needs. Yeah, that is a good point actually. But I wonder how much. I saw an interview with Giles Martin.
How much
And
input he actually had?
yeah, and he was not in his manner like a guy that was saying, "Oh, this is the best thing ever. This, you wait till you hear this." He was like, "Yeah, well, we did this and we did that, and it's," and you could tell from his approach that he was. It wasn't a big revelation for him what he had done or what he had been involved in. And he's not George Martin. George Martin ruled the roost. If George Martin didn't want to do something or thought that something was shit, George Martin would get his way because he was George Martin. Giles Martin isn't George Martin. So when George Martin goes up against the Beatles, they listen. And they do, well, we'll try what George says because George knows a thing or two. When Giles Martin is sitting in the room with whoever else is in the room and Paul McCartney's the boss.
Yeah.
Paul McCartney decides what that mix sounds like. And that's one of the problems I think we've got with these old musicians making mixes. Something I've got to look forward to in the forthcoming years.